Today, let's journey to the edge of the world, to the Fortress of Solitude, built by veteran Jonas Keene. He came to this ancient lighthouse to silence the thunderous echoes of war, a place where the only roar should have been the sea. But what his loyal dogs discovered in the suffocating coastal fog would prove that the most dangerous storms are not the ones that rage against the shore, but the ones that follow you in secret. Jonas Keene was a man haunted by the ghosts of a war he could never truly leave behind. This sentinel of stone and light on the rugged Oregon coast was his chosen sanctuary, a final stand against the memories that stalked him in the quiet of the night. His only anchors in this self-imposed exile were his two companions. Atlas, a magnificent German shepherd, was his shadow, a walking embodiment of the discipline and vigilance Jonas once lived by. And then there was Luna, a Siberian husky whose wild spirit and ice-blue eyes seemed tied to the ancient rhythms of the untamed coast. They were his guards, his confidants, his entire world. But one gray afternoon, the peace was broken. It wasn't by a sound, but by a sudden chilling shift in the air. Atlas, ever the guardian, stood rigid at the cliff's edge, a low guttural growl rumbling in his chest as he stared into the impenetrable wall of fog. At the same time, Luna began to whine, a soft, urgent sound of distress. She ignored the open sea and nudged Jonas's hand insistently, her gaze fixed on a dilapidated boathouse, half swallowed by the tide, a place he had always dismissed as empty. In that moment, as he felt the conflicting instincts of his two dogs, one sensing a threat, the other sensing a victim, Jonas Keene's carefully constructed peace shattered. He understood that the silence he had purchased was a lie. They were not alone. To uncover the secret hidden within the mist, and to witness how two loyal dogs become the key to a desperate battle for survival, please support our journey by subscribing to the channel. The growl that rumbled from Atlas's chest was not the sound of a dog, but of the earth itself preparing to fracture. It was a low seismic vibration I felt in the soles of my boots, a warning that resonated with every instinct my years in the service had honed to a razor's edge. He stood locked at the precipice, a black and tan statue of pure vigilance, his hackles raised like a dark ridge along his spine. His gaze was a physical force trying to pierce the suffocating veil of fog that had rolled in from the Pacific, erasing the world beyond 50 feet. While Atlas prepared for war, Luna pleaded for peace. Her soft, urgent whines were the antithesis of his aggression. She wasn't looking out at the endless churning gray, but down toward the dilapidated boathouse nestled precariously in the cove below. It was a skeletal structure slowly surrendering to the relentless salt and spray, a place I had long written off as a tomb for forgotten fishing gear. But Luna saw something more. She nudged my hand again, her intelligent ice-blue eyes begging me to understand. In the military, you learn to trust your spotter. Out here, my dogs were my spotters, my early warning system. Their conflicting reactions told me everything I needed to know. Whatever was in that boathouse was not a simple threat, but it was also not innocent. It was something that needed both a guardian and a guide. The silence I had craved was a lie. I was not alone. "Easy, Atlas," I commanded in a low voice, placing a hand on his powerful shoulder. The muscle beneath my palm was coiled steel. "Stay." He didn't relax, but he held his ground. I turned my attention to Luna. "All right, girl. Show me." Her tail gave a single, anxious thump against my leg, and she immediately began to lead the way down the treacherous path I had carved into the cliffside. The stones were slick with moss and sea spray, and each step was a calculated risk. The fog was a living entity around us, muffling the roar of the surf into a distant, hungry murmur. It tasted of salt and secrets. Atlas followed at my heel, his movements silent and predatory, a four-legged ghost in the mist. As we neared the boathouse, the smell of rot and brine was thick, but underneath it, Luna's sensitive nose had caught something else, the faint, almost imperceptible scent of human fear. The large wooden door, warped and bleached by the sun, was ajar by a mere sliver, not forced, not broken, just open. as if someone had slipped inside and hadn't had the strength or the will to close it fully behind them. My training screamed at me to announce myself to take control of the situation. But the man who had sought refuge in this lighthouse was not the soldier I used to be. That man was a ghost himself. I held up a hand, signaling both dogs to halt. Luna obeyed her whining, softening to a quiet hum of anxiety. Atlas stopped, instantly sinking into a low crouch, every fiber of his being focused on that sliver of darkness. I approached the door as silently as the fog itself, my heart a slow, heavy drum against my ribs. I peered through the crack. At first all I saw were shadows and the derelict remains of a small fishing vessel. Then my eyes adjusted. Huddled in the far corner, wrapped in a threadbare blanket, was a woman. Her face was pale and gaunt, etched with an exhaustion so profound it seemed to have carved its way into her very bones. But it was her eyes that seized me, wide, dark, and filled with the terrifying cornered look of a doe facing down a wolf pack. And then I saw him. Tucked against her side, almost completely hidden by the blanket, was a small boy. He couldn't have been more than 8. He was a statue carved from fear, his eyes vast dark pools that reflected a world I knew too well, a world of loud noises and sudden movements that forced a soul inward until it became silent. He didn't make a sound. The soldier in me assessed the threat, none. The man in me saw the wreckage. This was not what I had expected. This was not a vagrant or a lost hiker. This was a refugee, washed up on the shores of my solitude. Slowly, deliberately, I pushed the door open. The creak of the old hinges was an obscenity in the stillness. The woman flinched, pulling the boy tighter against her, her body becoming a fragile shield. Atlas's growl deepened, a clear warning that I was the master of this territory. Atlas. No, I said, my voice quiet but firm. But it was Luna who broke the standoff. She took a tentative step forward, her movements soft and deferential. She lay down on the damp floor, placing her head on her paws and letting out a soft, questioning sigh. Her ice-blue eyes never left the boy. For a long minute nothing happened. Then slowly a small hand emerged from the blanket and pointed a trembling finger at Luna. The boy Leo didn't speak a word, but his eyes asked 1,000 questions. That night they stayed in the lighthouse. The woman Elara spoke in hushed, fragmented sentences as she cradled a mug of hot tea, her hands shaking. They were running, not from the law but from the boy's father, her husband. He wasn't just a man, he was an architect of fear. A wealthy, powerful figure who had isolated her, controlled her, and convinced the world she was unstable. When she finally found the courage to flee with her son, he had mobilized all his resources to hunt them down. They had been on the road for weeks, living in shadows until their car broke down a few miles up the coast. They had seen the lighthouse as a ghost on the horizon, a place no one would think to look. As she spoke, I watched the boy. Leo remained silent, his world contained within the lines of a small, worn sketchbook he carried. He sat by the hearth not for the warmth, but because Luna had curled up there. He would occasionally reach out and bury his small fingers in her thick, soft fur. It was the only comfort he seemed to accept. And as I watched him, the carefully constructed walls around my own past began to crumble. The silence of the boy. It was a mirror. Suddenly I was no longer on the Oregon coast. I was back in the suffocating heat and dust of Kandahar. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and fear. My unit was clearing a village, and we found a family hiding in a cellar. There was a little girl, no older than Leo, with eyes just as dark and just as vast. She hadn't spoken a word, either her voice stolen by the horrors she had witnessed. I had knelt down just as Luna had, and offered her a piece of chocolate from my rations. I had promised her in broken Pashto and universal gestures that she was safe, that we would protect her. Hours later an IED ripped through the marketplace. We were too far away to help. The promise I made to her turned to ash in my mouth. Her silence became a permanent fixture in my nightmares, a constant screaming reminder of my failure. I had come to this lighthouse to escape that ghost, to build a fortress of solitude so thick that her silent screams could never find me. And now here was another silent child, another mother, fleeing a monster. The universe, in its cruel and calculated way, had brought the war back to my doorstep. This wasn't just about giving them shelter for a night. This was a chance, a terrible and terrifying chance for a redemption I had long ago decided I didn't deserve. My solitude was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a battlefield. The decision was made not in my head but in the deep wounded part of my soul that still answered to the call of duty. The next afternoon, the world outside confirmed the severity of our situation. I had a small battery-powered radio I used for weather forecasts. As I tuned the dial, a smooth, confident voice cut through the static. It wasn't the weather. It was a news report. Authorities are continuing the search for Ilara Vance and her 8-year-old son Leo, the reporter said. Her husband, philanthropist Marcus Vance, made an emotional public plea this morning, expressing deep concern for his wife's fragile mental state and the safety of their child. Mr. Vance has established a private hotline and is offering a substantial reward for any information leading to their safe return. My blood ran cold. He was painting her as the villain, the unstable mother who had kidnapped her own child. He wasn't just hunting them. He was turning the entire world into his posse, using his money and influence to control the narrative. There would be no sympathy for them, no safe harbor. Every well-meaning citizen, every police officer, would see them not as victims, but as a flight risk and a headline. I looked at Ilara. She had heard it too. The last flicker of hope in her eyes died, replaced by a dull, hollow resignation. The monster wasn't just a man anymore. He was a voice on the radio, a face on the news, a web of lies closing in around us. Then, as if to seal our fate, the radio announcer's voice shifted. And now a severe weather advisory from the National Weather Service. A powerful storm system, what meteorologists are calling a cyclonic beast, is rapidly intensifying off the coast. It is expected to make landfall within the next 24 hours, bringing with it Category 3 hurricane-force winds, torrential rain, and dangerously high surf. All residents along the coastal regions are advised to evacuate or seek immediate reinforced shelter. Travel will become impossible. I switched off the radio, the sudden silence in the room, feeling heavier and more menacing than the crackle of the static. 2 storms. One was a man made of ambition and cruelty, churning his way toward us with unstoppable resources. The other was a monster of wind and water, a force of nature preparing to unleash its full fury upon our tiny fortress of stone. We were trapped. The lighthouse was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cage, and the bars were closing in. The silence I had come here to find was a distant memory, replaced by the howl of an approaching storm and the silent plea in a young boy's eyes. My war had found me, and this time retreat was not an option. The storm did not arrive. It detonated. One moment, the world outside was a symphony of rising wind and sea. The next, it was a singular guttural roar that seemed to emanate from the planet's very core. The lighthouse, a bastion of stone that had defied the Pacific for a century, shuddered. The thick, solid floor beneath my feet vibrated with a deep, resonant hum, as if we were inside a colossal tuning fork that had just been struck. Rain driven horizontally didn't fall. It fired, impacting the thick lantern glass like volleys of buckshot. The sea, no longer a body of water, had transformed into a churning gray monster, throwing itself against the cliffs in explosions of white fury that climbed the full height of the tower. We were utterly and completely cut off. The world had ceased to exist beyond these stone walls. My fortress of solitude had become a prison, and the elements themselves were the wardens. Inside the chaos of the storm was mirrored by a terrifying silence. Leo, who had been quietly sketching in his notebook, was now huddled in a tight ball in the corner of the room, his small hands clamped over his ears. His eyes were wide, not with the fear of a child, but with the sheer overwhelming terror of a soul being drowned by sensory overload. The storm wasn't just a sound to him. It was a physical assault. The constant deafening roar, the vibration of the stone, the flickering of the emergency lanterns. It was a maelstrom attacking his senses from every direction. He began to rock a frantic, silent rhythm of pure anguish. Elara was at his side. Instantly, her face a mask of desperate helplessness. She tried to soothe him, her voice a low, calming whisper that was utterly lost in the tempest. But he was beyond her reach, trapped in a prison within our prison. And as I watched him, the ghost of Kandahar walked right through the stone walls and stood beside me. I saw the little girl in the cellar again, her eyes just as wide, her silence just as profound. I was a soldier trained to fight, to neutralize threats, to act. But here, faced with a small boy's internal war, I was powerless. I had guns, knives, and skills to survive almost any physical threat, but I had no weapon against this. The same crushing impotence I felt in that dusty marketplace washed over me a cold, familiar tide. I was failing again. My sanctuary had become a stage for my own personal hell, reenacted with a new cast. As if the storm and the boy's silent agony weren't enough, Atlas suddenly rose from his position by the door. The deep warning growl returned. But this time, it was different. It wasn't directed at the storm. It was lower, more focused, a sound aimed at a specific, intelligent threat. He moved to the base of the winding staircase, his eyes locked on the main entrance at the bottom of the tower. "What is it, boy?" I whispered, my voice hoarse. He ignored me. His attention was absolute. My heart hammered against my ribs. No one could be out there. No one. A flash of lightning illuminated the raging sea for a split second, and through the thick, salt-streaked glass of the lantern room, I saw it. For a fraction of a second, the impossible was made real. The clean, sharp outline of a private yacht fighting the waves, its powerful searchlight cutting a useless swathe through the rain. It was him, Marcus Vance. He had found us. The storm that was supposed to be our shield had become his cover. He had used its chaos to approach undetected, a predator, using the hurricane as his hunting blind. The choice was instantaneous and absolute. Stay and be caught. Stay and subject Leo to the monster his mother had sacrificed everything to escape. Or go. Go out into the teeth of the cyclonic beast. A death sentence either way, but one offered a flicker of agency. One was a fight. "We have to go." I said the words, feeling like gravel in my throat. Elara looked from her catatonic son to me, her eyes hollow. "Go where?" "Into that." She gestured to the window, to the apocalypse raging outside. My mind raced, tearing through the logistics of survival. There was no path, no shelter, no hope. It was in that moment of pure black despair that my eyes fell upon an old sea-worn chest, tucked under the main console, something left by the last lighthouse keeper decades ago. I had never bothered to open it. Driven by an instinct I didn't understand, I threw myself at it, prying the rusted latch open with the tip of my combat knife. Inside, amidst moldering logbooks and a tarnished sextant, was a rolled-up tube of oilcloth. My fingers, numb and clumsy, fumbled to untie the twine. I spread it open on the floor. It was a nautical chart of the coastline, but it was more than that. The last keeper had been a meticulous man, and in faded brown ink, he had made his own annotations. A spiderweb of hand-drawn lines, marking currents, reefs, and something else. A faint, dotted line snaked away from the base of the lighthouse, hugging the cliff face leading north. It was a path so treacherous, so close to the raging surf, that it would be invisible from both the sea and the land above. He had labeled it with a single spidery script, the smuggler's step. It was a ghost of a chance, a path that would be suicidal on a calm day. In this storm, it was a direct invitation to be swept into the boiling cauldron of the Pacific. To follow it by sight would be impossible. The fog, the rain, the sea spray, they would reduce visibility to zero. The map was a cruel joke, a glimpse of an escape route that was utterly unreachable. Defeated, I looked down, and my answer was looking back at me. It was Luna. She had been whining softly, her body pressed against the terrified boy. But now she stood up and walked over to the chart, her paws delicate amidst the brittle paper. She sniffed at the dotted line, then looked up at me, her ice-blue eyes burning with an intelligence that went beyond mere animal instinct. She took a step toward the stairwell door, looked back, and let out a single sharp bark. It wasn't a sound of fear, it was a command. And then I understood. The revelation struck me like a physical blow. I had been trying to navigate like a man with my eyes with a map, but I had a living compass at my feet. Luna was a husky, a creature whose entire lineage was forged in navigating featureless, treacherous landscapes by senses I could barely comprehend. She could smell the difference in the soil along the hidden path, a scent distinct from the surrounding rock. She could feel the subtle vibrations of the ground under her paws, a familiar route, even when buried under the chaos of the storm. She was not just a dog, she was a guide, her instincts a map woven from scent and sound and memory. At the same time, Atlas stood at the top of the stairs, his low growl a constant grim reminder. He wasn't focused on the path ahead, but on the threat behind. He was the guardian. Luna was showing me the how. Atlas was telling me the why. We had to go, and we had to go now. My two companions, with their conflicting instincts from the start, were now in perfect, terrifying harmony. One to lead us away from the storm, the other to stand against the monster it concealed. My isolation was a fool's dream. My survival, and the survival of the two souls I had sworn to protect, now depended entirely on my connection to these creatures, on my absolute faith in a language I did not speak. "Get him ready," I commanded Elara, my voice ringing with a newfound desperate resolve. "Wrap him in everything you can. We're leaving." The moment we opened the heavy oak door at the base of the tower, the storm tried to tear us from the face of the earth. The wind was a solid wall, a physical entity that stole the breath from my lungs. I hoisted Leo onto my back, his small trembling body cocooned in oilskins. He was terrifyingly light. I wrapped his arms around my neck and held his legs tight, turning my body into a human shield. "Elara, hold on to my jacket," I screamed over the roar. "Don't let go, no matter what." She grabbed a fistful of my coat, her knuckles white. Our formation was set. Luna took the lead, a silver ghost instantly dissolving into the gray maelstrom. My entire world shrank to the sight of her tail, a pale banner in the tempest. I followed it without question. Atlas took the rear, his powerful body acting as an anchor and a rear guard, his head constantly swiveling back toward the faint light of the pursuing boat. We were a single desperate organism, moving as one. The smuggler's step was not a path. It was a nightmare, etched into the rock. It was barely 2 feet wide, slick with sea slime, and lashed by the spume of exploding waves. To our right was the sheer black cliff face. To our left, a 50-foot drop into a churning vortex of water and rock that would pulverize a man in seconds. Every step was a negotiation with death. Luna was magnificent. She never hesitated. She would pause her nose to the ground, then pivot, finding the next section of the path that was completely invisible to me. I moved as if we were connected by an invisible thread, my feet landing where hers had been moments before. Elara was a rock. She never cried out, never faltered. Her entire being was focused on holding on to my jacket, her presence a constant, desperate pressure on my back. The waves were the true enemy. They would swell up from the darkness, these colossal walls of black water, and explode against the cliff below us, sending torrents of icy water cascading over the path. Each time we would flatten ourselves against the rock, the force of the water trying to peel us away like insects. It happened as we rounded a sharp outcrop. A rogue wave, bigger and more violent than the others, slammed into the cliff with the force of a freight train. The wall of water that hit us was a liquid battering ram. It tore Elara's grip from my jacket. I saw her stumble, her feet sliding on the slick rock. She was going over. Before I could even react, Atlas was there. With a guttural roar that defied the storm itself, he lunged, sinking his teeth into the thick fabric of her coat. His paws scrabbled for purchase, his immense strength, the only thing anchoring her to the world of the living. He held her, his body, straining a living clamp of muscle and loyalty, until I could get a hand on her and haul her back to the relative safety of the path. We huddled there for a moment, gasping, shivering, the line between life and death measured in the inches. Atlas had refused to surrender. We were no longer 4 individuals, We were a single unit, forged in the heart of the storm, bound by a primal unspoken trust. The soldier, the mother, the silent boy, the guide, and the guardian. Finally, after an eternity of fighting for every single footstep, Luna led us into a narrow fissure in the rock. We pushed through, and the roar of the storm was suddenly muffled. We had arrived. A small, sheltered cove, protected by a high wall of rock. A pocket of impossible calm in the middle of the apocalypse. We collapsed onto the sand, our bodies screaming, our lungs burning. We had survived. We had crossed the battlefield and made it to the other side. But as I looked down at Leo, his breathing still shallow, his small body shivering violently in my arms, I knew. We had escaped the cage, but our war was far from over. The cove was a pocket of impossible stillness. The cyclonic rage of the storm was still a monstrous presence, a deafening roar just beyond the high sheltering walls of rock. But here, in this hidden sanctuary, it was muted to a deep, resonant hum. The air was thick with the scent of salt and rain, but the wind's teeth had been pulled. We had stepped through a doorway in the heart of the apocalypse and found a quiet room. We lay on the wet sand for a long moment, a tangled heap of exhaustion and disbelief. Every muscle in my body screamed in protest, my lungs burning with each ragged breath. But we were alive. We were on the other side. My first thought was for Leo. I gently disentangled myself and checked on him. He was still wrapped in the cocoon of oilskins, his body shivering uncontrollably, his face ghostly pale in the dim storm-filtered light. His eyes were closed, not in sleep, but in a retreat so deep he was barely present. The sensory assault of the storm had pushed him to his breaking point. He had survived the journey, but I feared the internal battle was far from over. At the back of the cove, tucked into a recess in the cliff face, was a structure I hadn't seen from the path. It wasn't much, a small, sturdy cabin built from driftwood and salvaged timber, its roofline low and designed to shed the wind. A thin tendril of smoke, almost invisible against the gray rock, curled from a stone chimney. Life. Shelter. Hope. Luna was already trotting towards it, her tail giving a low, tentative wag. Atlas, the guardian, rose to his feet and positioned himself between us and the cabin, a low growl still vibrating in his chest. He had brought us to safety, but he was not yet ready to trust it. "Stay with him," I said to Alara, my voice a raw croak. I pushed myself to my feet, my legs feeling like lead, and began the short walk across the sand. As I approached, the cabin's heavy wooden door creaked open. The man who stood in the doorway looked as if he had been carved from the same rugged, sea-worn rock that surrounded us. He was older, perhaps in his late 60s, with a thick mane of silver hair and a beard that was as wild and untamed as the coastline itself. But it was his eyes that held me, a piercing, intelligent blue framed by a web of deep lines. They were eyes that had seen more than their share of storms, both literal and metaphorical. He held an old double-barreled shotgun, but it was pointed at the ground, his posture one of weary caution, not aggression. "Bit of a rough night for a stroll," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble like stones tumbling in the surf. His gaze swept over me, taking in my soaked, battered state, then flicked to the small, huddled group behind me. He saw Ilara cradling her son. He saw the magnificent, wary German shepherd standing guard. He saw the whole desperate story in a single, sweeping glance. We were shipwrecked. I lied the word, tasting like ash. Our boat went down off the point. He let out a short, humorless chuckle. "Son, there isn't a boat afloat in this storm that wouldn't be turned into splinters. And you're not dressed like a fisherman. You're dressed like a man who was running." He paused, his sharp eyes meeting mine. "The question is, from what?" There was no point in deception. This man lived in a world of harsh, simple truths. "From a man who is a bigger monster than the storm," I said. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes softened, a flicker of understanding. He nodded slowly, then gestured with the barrel of the shotgun towards the cabin. "Well, the storm makes no distinction. Get them inside. The boy looks like he's in a bad way." The inside of the cabin was a single, impeccably organized room, a stark contrast to the wild chaos outside. It was warm, dry, and smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and old books. A fire blazed in a stone hearth, and shelves lined with canned goods, medical supplies, and well-worn paperbacks covered every wall. This was the den of a man who was not just surviving, but thriving in his isolation. He introduced himself as Silas, a former Coast Guard rescue swimmer who had retired to this cove 20 years ago after one too many battles with the sea. As Alara gently laid Leo on a thick bearskin rug near the fire, Silas was already in motion. He was no longer just a reclusive old man. He was a medic, his years of training surging to the surface. He knelt beside the boy, his large calloused hands surprisingly gentle. Sensory overload, he grunted, his diagnosis immediate and certain. Happens to kids on the spectrum. The world gets too loud, too bright. They have to shut it all down to survive. He didn't ask questions. He gave quiet, confident commands. He had Alara wrap Leo in a heavy wool blanket, creating a cocoon of deep, calming pressure. He produced a pair of old noise-canceling headphones from a chest and gently placed them over the boy's ears, muffling the roar of the storm. He dimmed the lanterns, reducing the flickering light. He worked with a focused intensity, a man fighting an invisible enemy with practiced skill. And slowly, miraculously, the tide began to turn. The violent shivering in Leo's small body subsided into a mere tremble. The frantic, terrified energy receded, replaced by a profound healing exhaustion. He was not yet back, but he was no longer drowning. Silas, his medical duties momentarily complete, turned his attention to his other unexpected guests. He ladled hot, thick stew into bowls and handed them out, along with mugs of strong, steaming coffee. As I gratefully accepted a bowl, my hands trembling with cold and fatigue, Silas looked at me, his perceptive eyes taking in my military-style posture, the way I constantly scanned the room. "You military?" he asked quietly. I nodded. "Rangers. Long time ago." He gave a slow nod of understanding. A silent bond formed between us. A shared history that needed no further explanation. We were two old soldiers, washed up in a forgotten corner of the world, now caught in a new and unexpected kind of fight. Later, as the storm continued to rage, Silas moved to a corner of the cabin, dominated by a large, complex piece of equipment. It was a ham radio, an older model, with glowing vacuum tubes and a forest of dials, but it was immaculately maintained. He powered it on, and the cabin filled with the familiar crackle and hiss of static. He put on a heavy set of headphones, picked up a microphone, and began to speak, his voice, calm and professional, a coded language of call signs and maritime jargon. He was listening to the emergency frequencies, monitoring the chaos the storm was inflicting on the coast. For a long while there was nothing but fragmented reports of downed power lines and flooded roads. Then a new voice cut through the static, a clipped professional transmission from a Coast Guard cutter. "We have a visual on the vessel in distress." The Invictus, the voice crackled. "It appears to be a luxury yacht, approximately 60 feet. She's taking on water-lost engine power, drifting dangerously close to the Widowmaker Reef." My head snapped up. I looked at Alara. Her face was ashen. Invictus, unconquerable. The arrogant, self-aggrandizing name was exactly what Marcus Vance would name his boat. "Can you confirm the number of souls on board?" the radio operator asked. There was a pause. "Appears to be a single individual. He's on the deck now. Jesus the Fool is trying to launch a life raft in this sea." We listened frozen as the drama played out in real time over the radio. We heard the Coast Guard crew coordinating a high-risk rescue, their voices tight with tension. We heard the distant sound of the yacht's hull groaning as a wave slammed it against the first of the reef's jagged rocks. The storm, the very force of nature he had tried to use as his weapon, had turned on him. The relentless hunter had been stopped in his tracks, not by a man, but by the mountain of water he had so arrogantly challenged. His pursuit was over. A quiet, complex relief settled over the cabin. It wasn't triumph, just a deep, weary sense of justice delivered by an impartial hand. The next morning, the storm had broken. The world outside was transformed, reborn in a pristine, blinding light. The sea, though still powerful, had retreated to a deep royal blue. It was over. Silas was already back on the radio, but this time he was on a different frequency, a secure channel, He was speaking in low-clipped sentences to someone on the other end. "The threat is neutralized," he said, "but the situation is not resolved. I have the mother and child here. They're safe. Yes, the case I told you about. It's time to activate the network." He listened for a moment, then nodded. "Understood. We'll be ready." He signed off and turned to us, a rare, small smile touching the corners of his mouth. "That was a friend of mine," he explained to Ilara. "A lawyer who runs an underground railroad of sorts for people like you. She specializes in making ghosts disappear and giving them new lives. Help is on its way. They'll get you to a safe place somewhere he can never find you. They'll help you fight him in the courts, from a position of safety and strength." For the first time since I had met her, the terror in Ilara's eyes was replaced by a fragile, shimmering hope. The dam of her composure finally broke, and she wept not with fear, but with overwhelming cathartic relief. Later that day, as we waited, I sat on the cabin's porch watching the sea. Leo, his silence now calm and contemplative, sat beside me. Luna lay with her head in his lap, while Atlas stood a respectful distance away, his watch finally over. The boy reached out and for the first time gave the big German shepherd a shy pat on the head. I had come to the lighthouse seeking an escape from the world, a silence that could numb the ghosts of my past. But the ghosts had followed me. It wasn't the silence of solitude that had quieted them. It was the shared purpose of a desperate journey. It was the quiet gratitude in a mother's eyes. It was the feel of a small, trusting hand that had at some point during our ordeal found its way into mine. I had not escaped my past. I realized I had finally made peace with it. The wound in my heart, the one I had carried for over a decade, was still there, a scar that would never fully fade. But it no longer ached with the poison of regret and failure. It had been filled with something new, something unexpected. It had been filled with connection. The silence I had found was not the absence of noise. It was the quiet hum of a new beginning. A peace earned not in solitude, but in the heart of the storm, standing alongside others. My war was finally over. I was home. Here is a compelling conclusion, designed to summarize the journey, engage the audience, and build anticipation for future stories. And so, on that quiet shore, one journey ended and another began. The man who had come to the lighthouse seeking a fortress from the world had found his true sanctuary in protecting it. Jonas Keene sought a silence that could drown out the ghosts of his past. But he found a peace that was far more profound, not in the absence of noise, but in the purposeful rhythm of 4 beating hearts he had chosen to defend. The storm, a physical manifestation of the chaos he had tried to outrun, became the very crucible in which his new life was forged. It tore down his walls, not with wind and water, but with the undeniable power of connection, proving that the bravest act is not to stand alone against the dark, but to become a beacon for others lost within it. For Ilara and Leo, the future remains a path shrouded in mist, but it is a path they no longer walk alone. They were carried through the heart of the tempest, not just by a soldier's strength, but by the unwavering loyalty of 2 incredible companions. It was Atlas, the guardian, whose strength held the line against oblivion, and Luna, the guide, whose instincts wove a path through the impossible. They were the story's true compass, a reminder that sometimes the most important language is not spoken in words, but is felt through a steadfast presence at our side when the waves come crashing down. In every great journey, there is a guide and a guardian. We are left to wonder, was it Atlas's unwavering protection or Luna's intuitive guidance that truly saved them? What do you think? We believe that many of you have an Atlas or a Luna in your own lives, a loyal companion who has stood by you through your own storms. Share with us in the comments below the story of the friend who guided you. Your stories build this community and remind us that we are all part of a larger pack. But as this chapter closes, the book of their lives remains wide open. The storm may have passed, and the immediate threat may have been neutralized on the rocks of the Widowmaker Reef. But a man like Marcus Vance does not simply vanish. His power extends far beyond a single yacht, and his vengeance is a tide that will surely rise again. And what of the new world that has been revealed? Who is Silas, the quiet keeper of the coast? What is this network he spoke of? This underground railroad of lawyers and guardians hiding in the shadows? The battle for the lighthouse is over, but a new war fought in courtrooms and on shadowy coastlines has just begun. Jonas has found his purpose, but that purpose may lead him into storms far more dangerous than the one he just survived. To be the first to embark on the next leg of this journey, and to discover the secrets of the network that protects the forgotten, make sure you subscribe and ring the bell. You won't want to miss where the current takes us next.